In the run up to this show, you had mentioned, Matthew, that you have trouble with peak experiences, and that is something that flow states evolved from Maslow's idea of peak experiences. So there's kind of it's just a linguistic thing, but it's essentially the same idea. I want to respond to that in two parts. First off, Candomblé is West African, so I don't know that much about Yoruba and Bantu, but I know a little bit more about Ganawa, so North African, same general trance ideas, which is the ceremony will start at sundown or shortly thereafter, and the music goes on for 8 to 10 hours until the sun rises, and the dancers are predominantly dancing the entire time. The singers are chanting, and so from my perspective, I want to look at it in terms of the physiology of what's happening to their nervous systems if you get into a trance state by dancing for 6 to 8 hours, and what is possible at that time. Now, you brought up the idea of sort of a Western belief or looking at it that way. But in terms of flow state research, hundreds, or probably at this point, thousands of people have been studied under fMRI technology while engaging in flow state activities. And what they found was there was a shutting down of the prefrontal cortex. And when this research started in the 1980s, it thought that there was going to be hyperactivity in the brain. It actually turned out to be hypoactivity. So the areas of the prefrontal cortex that were shut down were actually parts of the brain that had to deal with identity. And so what does that mean? Well, there's an immersion in your surroundings. There's a sense of the boundaries between your body and then your environment dissolving, so that the activity you are doing and your personal history and baggage and everything that goes along with it are now dissolved, so that you feel at one with that activity. And what's amazing is with flow states, it can only happen if you're enjoying the activity. So it has to be something you're passionate about. It can be reading, but it's often correlated with physical activities. So we have a way of looking at these things and measuring them to say, well, across all domains, even though they're vastly different rituals that are happening, the same activity neurologically is happening. Does that mean that the brain is causing it? No, it's environmental, it's social. There's a lot more to that. But we have a way of actually looking at these phenomenon and being like, wow, there are actually activities that cut across cultures and domains and times that we can investigate and learn from. And I think some of that, almost a mysticism of science, when you look at it from that way, as Ramachandran would say, it is really useful for us, but we get so caught up in our own specific domain that we forget that other domains, that those states are possible in other domains as well.
Well, let me add to that too, Derek. I love what you were just saying in terms of how you're unpacking flow states and kind of the universality of the human organism, right? That our nervous systems and brains are the same. And so it cuts across different cultures. And while the entry point may be different, people in all times and places have figured out ways to access these states that we find beneficial, meaningful, etc. Not only is it about the dissolving of the boundaries between self and environment and self and other, but also a sense of timelessness, right? Also a sense of being at the center of the universe itself, connected with everyone, a sense of great peace and effortless kind of awareness, just doing what it does. So yeah, I want to second all of that. And I also want to say that I would never want to, on an interpersonal level, I would never, ever want to take away from what you were describing, Myrna, as, having this practice that does that for her, that does what we've just been describing. I would never want to take away from this woman who has healed from horrific experiences, using what she has available to her from her culture within her particular environment, and that being beneficial to her. I think that people who get bitten by the rationalist bug just maybe have a certain kind of temperament where we say, well, yes, all of that, and it matters at the end of the day what we think is really true, and figuring out what's true in these kind of ultimate ways is a worthwhile endeavor. And so the experiences can be meaningful and valid and not be true. And as you've highlighted and underlined beautifully, Matthew, that can be problematic in certain cases, and maybe in other cases it just is what it is, and a healthy dose of humility and acceptance of other people's path is a good thing.
Well, I think that I really focused on this juxtaposition between people finding a kind of resistance within Candomblé and also Umbanda as the other practice, in response to the kind of Christofascism that we see in John of God. But to go back to this premise of the universality of flow states and the fact that, you know, they are just accessible to everybody, and we are starting to understand the organics of it. The reason that this comparison is really amazing to me is that when people are sitting in the quote unquote flow at the Casa in Abadiânia with John of God, they're in flow states too. And that's why that's how they are being abused. And so, you know, it's like, it feels like the organic and biological descriptions of the flow states are one thing, and then there's this other question of, well, what's the community of care that's actually holding them?
Group flow is also a studied phenomenon. Charles Lim at Johns Hopkins studied jazz and hip hop improvisational artists, where he hooked up them to fMRI while they were playing and found that their brainwaves synchronized while they were performing together. And take that at a large scale, you can really call college football in America chances for group flow to happen. It's soccer, right, around the world. Like, that completely happens. That's why people lose their identity, and sometimes the violence that happens after their team loses, because they're so invested in that.
On both counts, the comparison to religion that's often made, I think, is a valid one. That for them, football is a religion.
Yes. And just like our talks that we've had in previous weeks about psychedelics, these are content-free experiences. So if your thing is going off and listening to this guy, and you're doing the reporting on John of God, I'm not that familiar, but if you're in a state where you're meditating together, dancing together, whatever that ritual environment you're in, if that is something that gives you a sense of community, then whatever content is being put out there, once you reach that state, you are going to be open like a book for them to put that content in there. And that, to me, is part of the indoctrination process.
Yeah, and then that flow states are also highly suggestible. So we're susceptible both to our motivated reasoning that says, "Oh, I had this experience; it must mean this," and we're susceptible to others who we trust saying, now you've had the knowledge, as Prem Rawat calls it, right? And so now you know that I'm really God on earth."